Hello. I'm Russell Green. I'm the Will Clayton Fellow for International Economics here at the Baker Institute, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce to you the Honorable David C. Mulford. Ambassador Mulford is the Vice Chairman International at Credit Suisse. We're going to hear from him talking about India, as he is the former ambassador to the from the United States to India, where he served during a transformative period of the U.S.-India relationship from 2004 through 2009. And oversaw numerous major accomplishments, including the U.S.-India nuclear deal. On his watch, we had the unfortunate Mumbai attacks, but that was beneficial for the U.S.-India relationship as it greatly transformed the degrees of trust with U.S. help in that episode. Prior to that, Ambassador Mulford was with Credit Suisse, but also served as U.S. Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs in both Reagan terms and through the entire first Bush administration. So he's a man with fantastic breadth of experience, and we're lucky to have him here. So with that, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Mulford.
Thank you very much, Russell. I'm very grateful to you for inviting me down here. It's an honor to be here. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you. I will speak very informally, and I hope this turns out to be a stimulating and fun evening. I don't do much in the way of giving lectures, so I'll speak rather reasonable period of time and then open up to what I hope is a dialogue with you, which is how I'd prefer to spend the evening. I should begin by saying that I know Jim Baker isn't here at the moment, but I did work for Jim Baker for 4 years at the Treasury, and I remember my very first experience with him, the first time I met him. And that was when I was asked to come up to the Secretary's office, Don Regan, who was swapping jobs with Jim at that time. And the congressional relations people were there. And they said, we want you to go over to the White House and see Mr. Baker and help to prepare him for his congressional hearing. So please go over and make sure when you meet him that you ask him very tough questions, because they'll be asking tough questions. So you want to really get him prepared. So I said, okay, I'll go over and meet him. So I went over and I met Jim. And I said, I'm here to brief you and help you prepare for your congressional hearing. So I'd like to ask you a few questions. So my first question was, what do you think qualifies you to be Secretary of the Treasury and deal with all the complicated affairs of international financial affairs of the United States? He looked at me, with that look that he has, and he said, I would say the preparation of 7 economic summits for the President of the United States and 4 years in the Marine Corps. And so that took care of that question. And I was a little more reserved in my further questions. So is India still rising? This was the topic that was set with a question mark. And my answer to that very shortly is it is still rising in a very remarkable and fundamental way. And it is a rising that will, in my view, continue. That's the headline. Now, nobody should represent that India is an easy country or an easy country to get things done, or is a country that is anything other than a very large, genuine democracy of great diversity. And as I say, a kaleidoscopic nation of color, movement, and everything you can think of under the sun. Always a great, entertaining place to visit, to watch, to listen, meet people, and it is a wonderful country. Everybody knows that India has lots of problems, shortcomings, deficiencies, confusions, so we should get over that. I acknowledge all that. And yet I am extremely positive. So I'd like to explain why. And I think my experience there was long enough and over a unique period, which enables me to have the views that I'm going to express. Plus, since then, I have been in constant contact with investors around the world, whom I see a great deal of my time. I do some investment banking, but I do a lot of work with hedge funds and international investors of various kinds and so on. And these are, populated by smart people who ask a lot of questions and put you on the spot on things. So I get a lot of practice, and I get a lot of chance to think about things. And then I go to India 2 or 3 times a year. My wife had breast cancer when she was there, and was cured. And then when she came back, she initiated the first Walk for Life for Cancer Awareness in New Delhi in 2008. So we go back each year for that because she leads the walk, and this is a major event in her life, and for both of us. So let's just go back and make sure we're on the same wavelength on India's past. Not too much history, but some. 1947, India was formed, and for the years between 47 and 2003, it never grew faster than 2.5% to 4.5%, with exceptions where it touched 5 but never sustained 5%. Meanwhile, the population in 1947 was 300,000. By 2000 or so, it was 1.1 or 1.2 billion. So I always say the 2 main products of India's first 60 years were, first of all, poverty, because it didn't grow fast enough to take care of its population growth, and secondly, democracy, most remarkably, to have created a genuine democracy of the type India has after partition and the violence that took place at that time. Everything morphed over the years into a truly democratic society. It is a chaotic place, that's true, but it is very stable. So if you can fit those things together, then you can begin to understand India. Until 1991, when the reforms began under Manmohan Singh, India was a very closed economy, a sort of import substitution economy, not really very open to the world at large, and it regarded itself as the sort of self-appointed leader of the non-aligned world in those years. I was at Treasury in many of those years, and I used to have to meet Indian delegations, and they were always on the other side of issues from us in the United States. And the relationship with India, between the U.S. and India, was very up and down over those years. And the Gandhi dynasty, if you want to call it that, was very, very paternalistic in its view of policy towards rural India, where 80% of the people lived. And it gave them a different view of the world and made it hard to cooperate. I think in the United Nations, it was rare, actually, for India to support the United States in votes over those years. And yet, after 1991, when India began its reforms, things began to change. First of all, the reforms initially were more in the nature of opening India to the world than they were internal structural reforms. And the opening process was something India was really forced to do at that time because of its financial situation. And gradually, they began to show some signs of stronger growth, although they had coalition governments during the 90s. But the great setback in that period came when India tested its nuclear weapon in 1998, and as a result drew sanctions from the United States and many other countries around the world. These sanctions were very punitive, and they were very embarrassing to India militarily, because India imports most of its weapons, and many of those weapons became unusable or difficult to service because they had dual-use parts and et cetera, covered by sanctions. The sanctions were lifted by George W. Bush in 2001, and within 1 year, there had been the Pakistani attack on the Indian parliament, which took place early in 2002. And all of these events disrupted India's continuity and undermined, to some extent, its capacity to really establish higher growth levels. So the first year that growth really penetrated and was sustained above 5% was 2003. So that is the year I date, quote unquote, the modern Indian economy from. And I think this is a very important distinction when you look at India's prospects, because they really date in a major way from then. In those years, 03, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, growth went from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 9, 10, 10+%. And India really enjoyed a major breakout. And the reforms began to be more than just opening to the world. They began to be internal reforms that were promoting growth or assisting growth. There was a lot of slowness there, a lot of difficulty, but these things did begin to happen. And the United States, George W. Bush, made an initiative in 2005 of extreme importance in terms of its so-called strategic relationship with India, which is what George Bush wanted, and which we were dedicated to try to achieve in a major way. When the United States agreed to negotiate with India a civil nuclear agreement that would restore India's access to global civil nuclear technology, even though it had not signed the 1974 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Under that treaty, a country that hadn't signed it couldn't have nuclear weapons. If it wanted to sign the treaty and gain access to global civil nuclear technology, it had to give up its nuclear weapons. India had developed its own nuclear weapons. China had nuclear weapons. Pakistan had nuclear weapons. And therefore, their view was they wouldn't and couldn't give up the weapons. And George W. Bush took the view, we better be on the right side of history, accept this, and negotiate an agreement with them that would establish this access once again after 35 years of isolation. And that was regarded as the most important diplomatic act in India of the past 50 years. It took us 3.5 years to negotiate that agreement. It was successfully concluded in October of 2008, and India enjoys the position among all nations, about number 6 outside of the big 5, where it has nuclear weapons, hasn't signed the treaty, has access to full civil nuclear technology. It's a very rare and privileged position. And India's game plan, which it hasn't executed yet, was to build its own expanded civil nuclear industry so that it could depend more on civil nuclear generated electric power and avoid becoming the world's greatest polluter after China. So it was a very important political goal for them. Anyway, that background, I think, is very important to understand, because what happened in the next years after that, and this is, I think, what one has to try to come to understand as to why I feel so positive about India's progress, is that in those breakout years, especially in the years of 06, 07, 08, a remarkable phenomenon took place, and that was that India established mobile telecom coverage of the entire country in a short space of about 3 years. In a country of 800,000 villages and 70 to 80% of the people living in rural areas in an agricultural economy setting, many of the people subsistence level people, to accomplish that step was something of a miracle. And it happened, as I said, in 3 quick years. At the same time, the Congress-led government exercised its usual philosophy of paternalistic policies and distributed lots of money and subsidies and so on into rural India, which was their habit going way back. So fertilizer subsidies, food subsidies, 100 days of work, a variety of different policies. And the effect of these 2 things was remarkable, because it created, for the first time, among Indian rural families their first ever slice of disposable income. And they began to spend on simple, fast-moving consumer goods. But this gave real energy to the economy, and moreover, it raised expectations of people. Indians have very high expectations for themselves and their children, and they're prepared to work and seek out opportunities. And this change enabled that process to really begin to take off, a sort of revolution in expectations. And at the time, I identified this as the transformative event of that decade, because rural India was beginning to be transformed, which had never happened before. And by having mobile telecom coverage, they skipped an entire generation of investment in fixed line coverage in the normal fashion. So huge amounts of infrastructure were simply frog leaped into the future. And in the years after I got there, when rural India was very rural still, as I traveled around, all of a sudden there began to be handsets appearing in the hands of everybody, farmers, women in the villages, kids. And they were very simple sets, about $11 to buy, almost free to use, and very sort of primitive in a way. But they really struck a chord and people bought them. And then that was followed by the next government of Manmohan Singh, 5 more years, when momentum and growth was lost, and India fell back to about a 5.5% growth rate over those years. And people began to question India's momentum and progress. Its growth no longer was at 10%. It wasn't a leading player among emerging markets. It was falling into a lesser category. And there was a lot of criticism of the government. The second administration of Manmohan Singh lacked momentum, continuity, and decisiveness. And it began to be a situation where people were really very, very concerned. And into that situation is when Modi emerged as a major political player. He was the governor of the state of Gujarat, had been very successful there for 12 years, the highest growth rate in India, the highest foreign and direct investment rate in India. And he himself had some problems in '02 that were still haunting him, in riots that took place in '02. But he was very much a chief minister of his state. But people began to thirst for a chief executive. If you talk to people, they'd say, well, I don't know if I trust Modi. Maybe he's a Hindu nationalist. Maybe he'll divide the communities, et cetera, et cetera. But we need a chief executive, somebody who really runs this place and gets us back on the track. And that is how he got elected. Rather quickly, he moved to spokesman of the BJP and then candidate for prime minister, and he won the election in a very significant way with an absolute majority, which was not seen in India for something like 20 years, at least. So that was a moment of extreme importance. It was followed then, since then, by India's current situation. And this is where one has to really focus judgment on what is happening and what Modi is or isn't achieving. There's been a lot of criticism by economists, media people, political commentators, and so on about Modi coming in and then not doing enough of the right things and losing momentum and not following through on the things that he should be doing and even on the things he said he would do. And all of that has an element of truth in it. But I think what's involved here is a failure to really look at what is happening in India. And that's what I'd like to spend the next few minutes on before we open up to questions, because it is the kernel of the question, is India still rising? First of all, Modi took office, and first he went to Japan, China, and Brazil. No prime minister had ever gone to foreign countries in his first 3 weeks in office. And he announced a few weeks later a new foreign policy for India. It was that India would no longer just be a balancing factor in global diplomacy, it would be a promoter of initiatives in global diplomacy. And he'd gone to these 3 very important countries. He hadn't called Mr. Obama or come to Washington. He'd done what he thought was the important things to do. And he then, instead of doing the kind of things a leader does to be measured in his first 100 days in office, and nothing happens in 100 days in India anyway. So he avoided that. He didn't get trapped in that. He simply disappeared in a way. And in his first budget, which was in July that year, he didn't do what everybody thought he would do, kind of amend it and reform it and promote it with BJP ideas and so on. He just made a few twerks to it and then went ahead with it. Instead, he introduced some very visionary ideas. And these ideas I just want to convey to you, because you can read about all the economics and commentators' views anywhere if you have that interest. He introduced what seems a very simple idea, which was that every Indian should have a bank account. Now, in our country, nobody cares about that because everybody has bank accounts, too many often. But in India, it's not true because Indians don't trust banks. They save on their arms, gold under their mattress, wherever. They do not use banks. So the penetration rate of banks is very low in India. But he introduced this idea, especially for women who are the head of the household and make the spending decisions in Indian families. So he wanted them in particular to have a bank account. Now, what he meant by a bank account was not a normal bank account. It was what you would call a payment account or a payment platform. And that is an account, small, from which you can make money transfers electronically to another account. If you think of that simple idea where an amount of money is sent electronically and received almost immediately, and it is the same amount, you're addressing a problem which for generations in India has been a real problem and has undercut trust in banks, namely Indians working in urban India, transferring money to family in rural India, were constantly being ripped off. The different amounts of money would arrive, cash would be taken out, cash changed hands. It was a very awkward system, so there was a lack of any kind of confidence in the distribution system. And yet people had to transfer money to relatives because there's great distances involved. And frankly, they had a bad experience for generations, not just shortly, but for generations. So here was an idea that would allow a family or a person working in urban India to transfer an amount of money and be assured that it got there. Very big idea. Secondly, he made the same decision on the transfer of monies for the gigantic distribution of subsidies in India, government subsidies. He announced that they were going to be transferred electronically and not in the form of cash, where, according to the figures, 30 to 35% of those transfers of subsidies were leaking, being lost or taken by corrupt players in the system. And people had said when he was elected, well, he's going to have to kick the teeth in of his people who elected him, the rural farmers, by cutting their subsidies. He didn't do that. He instead addressed the question of leakage in the system, which helped the fiscal accounts and didn't cut the subsidy of the recipient, but improved the delivery of that money. Now, there's a third part of this, and that is that he announced that there was going to be licenses given for this activity. And the licenses were distributed, and some banks applied and won a license. But who also won a license were two of the big telecom companies. So why did they want a license? Because they could see that in this system, the simple primitive handset wasn't going to serve anymore. They would need to develop more complex and sophisticated handsets to allow people to do things online. And this is a way to overcome the distances and the infrastructure difficulties of India. And it was, in my view, a brilliant idea which will promote, and is promoting already, the development of e-commerce in India. And this raises a very interesting point. I was in India about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I was speaking to one of the companies that is engaged in this, and I said to them, how does it work when you have a 45% literacy rate in many parts of India to use a more sophisticated handset? Because he was talking about how there was training going from the top down and so on. I said, what about all these illiterate people? What happens to more sophisticated handset use? And the answer was striking. He said, you'd be surprised that people who are illiterate are able to use that kind of a handset as effectively as anybody else. They overcome the literacy difficulties by learning how to use the functions on the handset. So, you know, this is a revolutionary breakthrough, because it means that India will be going online much faster than anybody would have expected, and that is indeed what's happening. The other piece of this picture began before Modi came to power, when a man named Hanan Nilekhani was asked by the government to serve as a minister to create a program of identity cards for Indians. And this was undertaken, I think it was about 5 years ago, maybe it was when I was in India. And this is an iris ID system, so completely accurate. And they have been issuing cards on a nonstop basis. And I'm told they're up around 1 billion now. And these cards, a person in a village can take his card to his greengrocer. He may have a bank account in a bank 100 miles away. Give the card to the greengrocer. The greengrocer identifies him in 4 seconds accurately and can fund him with a withdrawal from his account. The debit is then created in the bank. So here again, you don't need branches in every one of 800,000 villages to run the system. So these kinds of changes and others, such as, for example, when I was there this past month, I interviewed companies that are working on paperless transactions. And these are obviously startup companies, great investment opportunities, maybe. But what they bring is a future of efficient economic transactions. And like I said before on the telephone lines, fixed line telephones, India may leapfrog a whole generation of credit cards and credit card bureaucracies that are entrenched in our system, and they may move straight to a more modern system. So there's a couple of examples of what is going on in India that I think distinguishes India at this point in time in a very major way. There are many other examples, but we can talk about them later if you'd like to delve into them. For the purpose of this point, I would like to say that when I tell people about India, they say to me, would you invest? Should we invest? It's a difficult place to invest for a whole lot of other reasons. The complexities and rules of the bureaucracy, the restrictions on sectoral investments, and so on. But what I say to people is, today India is the leading growing country among all emerging markets. When it was growing at 10%, China was growing at 12%. Today, China's growing at, if you believe any figures, 6 or 6.5. Other people say 4, 4.5. But I can tell you one thing about China. Their adjustment is not going to be, their reform process, their reform adjustments are not going to be accomplished in a short period of time. They are very complex politically and very hard to carry out. I foresee difficulties in China lasting over, say, 5 or 6 years. This means that the tortoise, which passed the hare, will occupy the leading position among emerging market countries for a considerable period of years. Add to the fact that India imports 72, 73% of its oil, and oil prices are down. A pure gift to Mr. Modi and the Indian economy. Consider the fact that this year was the best monsoon since 1954, I'm told. And a good monsoon means cheaper food prices, and that means lower inflation in India. So India's tendency for inflation is going to be reduced. And when that happens, the central bank will cut rates. And when they cut rates, you will see stronger domestic investment-led growth. So if you put all that together, in my view, you're looking at a long-term position where India is really going to continue to grow. I hate to say it this way, but also almost in spite of itself, because the rural economic transformation that is going on has real dynamism about it. And I believe that analysts, economic analysts, and media analysts, and so on, they don't know how to measure this dynamism, how to get your hands around 800,000 villages and individual activity, and the growth of banking services and the types of things I've been talking about. I see a country that is going to grow at 7 to 8%, possibly higher over the next 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years, and will, as it grows, of course, enjoy the benefits of a rising GDP value and standard of living and so on. Now, there's problems, we all know. Better education, absolutely vital. More jobs have to be created. Everybody knows that. Those are real challenges for Mr. Modi. But the dynamic is there. And so that's the basis of my thoughts on that. So rather than go on and make other examples, I thought I might just open up with you, and we could talk about these or any other international issues you care to raise. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Ambassador Murford, thank you very much. I really appreciated your talk. I run a global macro investment fund, and I wanted to request if you could take a step back and look at a bigger picture. Your examples have been very individualistic. So looking at longer-term trends, one of my rationales for India's growth is because of the population hump that is powering the country. And the population hump is expected to reach its peak in the next, say, 10 to 20 years. However, the country's per capita income is today still one of the lowest in the world. And we are seeing already a migration from India to other lower wage countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam for, textile jobs and other low wage jobs. So even though India is rising at 7 to 8%, my concern is, and this is a concern that's been shared by some global macroeconomists, is that India might not be able to raise its profile on a per capita basis from a low-wage country to a middle-income country because of this differences in pace. 7 to 8% is not sufficient for this growth to happen. What are your views on this economic data that we are seeing?
Well, my view on that is that a good plan this week is better than a perfect plan next week, first of all. And secondly, these are the challenges. The primary and secondary education system of India is broken. Everybody goes to private schools if they possibly can, but not everybody can. Job creation is inadequate. That ought to be cured to some extent by lower rates and stronger domestic investment. But India is still very much a subsistence-dominated economy and an agricultural economy. In the first figures I gave you, from 47 until, let's say, 2000, they had low growth and even lower slice of agricultural growth. In the period between 2009 2014, when they sunk down to 5.5% growth, it's interesting to note that agricultural growth remained a relatively higher proportion of total growth. In other words, the hit was taken by urban and middle-class India in those years, and less by traditional India. So the expectations were not as severely affected rurally. And the opportunities for investment in rural India are just prodigious. You know, and as you know, you go around in June and grain is lying in the fields and the monsoon's coming and you can't pick it up fast enough. Large amount of crops are destroyed each year by failure of the infrastructure system to pick them up and move them. These are all problems that can be addressed. They will not be addressed as effectively as you'd like them to be in India. Likewise, the problems you mentioned, low wages. But if you look at it in another way, India has a young workforce. It is a rather well-educated workforce. Those parts of it that are educated are really very well-trained people. We have them all over the United States, for example. My view is that this workforce will remain, and they speak English largely. So this workforce will remain one of the most competitively priced workforces in the world over the next generation. That will be one of India's great advantages. So the fact that they don't increase their income to, middle income levels as quickly as everybody thinks they should, I don't think is going to matter as long as they're moving in the right direction, because it's that the Indians want. And I don't think you have to meet a sort of global standard. India remains a very peaceful country. It has very large and divided populations, very little in the way of radicalization in those various communities. And there's one other feature of India that I'd like to draw your attention to that I didn't mention, and that is that when Modi came to power, one of the first things he did was scrap the Planning Commission. They had a Planning Commission, Soviet style, for all the years since independence, and he scrapped it from one day to the next. And the Planning Commission was very powerful in India. And one of its jobs was to adjudicate the distribution of financial resources between federal and state projects. So they had a really heavy hand in the manipulation of that process. Once he abolished it, he then began to push more money into the states. We've done quite a lot of research on this, and we show a faster rise of spending in the states of India than in the federal government. I suspect he began to do that because he wanted to use that to win state elections so he could influence his position in Parliament positively. But that hasn't worked very well because he hasn't won elections very easily, at all, hardly. And there's more elections to come. But one of the effects of this is dramatic. When I got to India and I went around and met chief ministers and governors in the various states, every one of them was sort of 80 plus. They were dressed in traditional style. They were kind of old boys from Congress politics and the rural areas and so on. But within a few years, this began to change, and younger people started moving into state politics. And once the money started coming in, the result is that a lot of people in state politics are working their way, first of all, into better state performance, which I think is Modi's intention, to create more competition among states in the hope that another 4 or 5 become mini Gujarats, which will create more jobs and better incomes and so on. And the distribution of these resources is very, very important. And one of the reasons it works so quickly is that under the Indian Constitution, the distribution of powers between the states and the federal government is clearly defined. It's all in writing, all in black and white in 1947. It's not like the United States where we have to go to the Supreme Court to figure out states versus federal. All this stuff is there. State responsibilities, federal responsibilities, shared responsibilities. So these guys who come into politics They got it in black and white what they can do. Education, roads, water, electricity, whatever it is. And they're getting the resources to do it. So it seems to me that politics is going to change substantially in India, and there's going to be a significant increase in growth, job creation, and so on, especially with the favorable factors I mentioned earlier of declining inflation, continued lower oil prices, and so on. So I just have a very optimistic view of that, and I don't think they need to meet the standard of middle income that somebody in the World Bank thinks is important. I don't think it matters if you're an Indian in an Indian village and just trying to get ahead.
The reason I asked is, I'm not disputing anything you're saying. I mean, India's growing 7-8%, the fastest growing country in the world. Everything you said, I totally agree with. The argument really was that the opportunities that are being presented today from external investors or external needs might disappear. That was really the argument. And because of that, that might have an adverse effect on the low-wage jobs.
Right.
And based on typical countries' performance in the past, you know, you can look at industrial age in Europe or India or US a long time ago. That was really the thrust of the question. Based on that, people were concerned that India is not growing fast enough. It's growing 7-8%, that's great, but it's not fast enough for where it is today in its age in terms of, you know, how far it is away from the population hub. That was really the question.
Well, the people who decide that will be the voters in India as to whether or not they think they're growing fast. I go back to, you know, we live in a world where all these standards are set by external people and agencies and newspapers and journals and all the rest of it. And I often say to people, you know, if you want to really understand India, think of it in terms of not Singapore and Hong Kong and all these other places. Think of it like the 19th century America. Big land mass, poor people all over, lousy infrastructure, robber barons in every direction, later who built libraries maybe, but you know, it's that kind of situation. And I think you have to look at it that way. And it's a democracy, so people vote, and they have that freedom to say whether or not wages are growing fast enough. And if they're not growing fast enough, they'll vote somebody in who make them grow faster. At least that's my view. So I think this, and I realize I read all kinds of stuff that point out all the problems. And believe me, I know all the problems in India because I had to live with them and try to get things done. It isn't easy. It's not an easy place to work under any circumstance. And they do not do the things often that should clearly be in their interest. But, you know, they have their own version of what we call American exceptionalism, except it's Indian exceptionalism. And you get a lot of that, and that's just how it is.
Question. I want to change the topic
Yeah.
about democracy and you know, communism, or you know, what's going on in China, which is quasi-capitalistic communism, if you want to call it. What kind of an impact do you foresee that such kind of an approach is against India's? It's chaotic, of course, but I'm a US citizen. I've been living in this country for 30 years, and I observe India from outside now. What effect will that have in its long-term growth prospects, and also how India can tackle some of these issues, like, you know, in China, for example, I'm a professor here at Rice, and I travel to China every year for various academic reasons, and I've seen growth explode in China, and at the same time in India it does not explode at the same rate because of all the problems that you mentioned. But I honestly feel that democracies are much better than all these artificial building that's going on in China and so on, which may look very rosy now, but we are seeing the problems right away. What do you think about this perspective?
Well, China and India are utterly different and always will be. India, as I said, is a genuine democracy. China is not. China has recently been permitted to join the SDR, which means it's an aspiring reserve currency country. A reserve currency country is a country that is transparent, publishes accurate data, and provides accurate data. China does none of those things. I don't understand how they got to be in the SDR. I don't think they have any credibility, frankly. Now they're going through a process of reform, which is very, we admire that. We accept that they should be trying to do it. But the complexity of it in China is just unbelievable because of how they run the country. They started by making a small market economy, which they peopled with bureaucrats and ran successfully, i.e. big exports, growth, job creation, but the world didn't like the model and came against it. So then they moved to try to bring a market model in their national economy. That's a much bigger and more difficult proposition. And because one of the facts of life with market economies is that they require increasing degrees of personal freedom, of choice, civil choice. And they're finding it's difficult to keep control and to try to accomplish that same objective. They have all these people in China who are illegal immigrants in their own country. They're in the wrong places with the wrong papers and documents. And they haven't been able to rationalize their healthcare system, their pension system, their other safety net positions. And they run this economy which permits banks to have huge non-performing loans. And they've had that for 25 years. So what's the result? I hear it when I'm in India, people come and say, well, in China they really are growing. They can build a road anywhere they want in 6 months. And I say, yeah, but does the road go to the right place? And do the buildings at the end of the road have people in them? And what happened to the 10,000 people who got moved? People complain about infrastructure in India. And I say to Americans, let's give a measure of respect to India, where people like their land, don't want the government to take it. And if average farm size, as it is in India, is 3.5 acres, the government takes all your land, not just a corner of it to put a superhighway through and you have 100 acres or something. And Indians fight this, and they can go to court and prevent it, so they make life difficult. Roads are built very slowly as a result. But here we are in a democracy. Any one of us with land would probably fight it being taken over by a government to do something anyway. So we should admire that, even though I know it's a frustration to everybody and helps and is adverse to growth and so on. But China is living on borrowed time, in my view. And it is already turning to a more authoritarian governance. And it looks like the current leader is engineering a situation where he will be reappointed for another 10 years or whatever it is. That's a sign that it doesn't work. And if you follow central banking and exchange rates and so on, who in the world knows what their monetary policy is and what their exchange rate policy is? Nobody that I know. So I just think it's a completely different cup of tea, basically. And my money is on, long term, is on a country that is more stable, more democratic, more inclusive in terms of its people. It's a much better formula for slower but steadier progress. Yes, sir.
Is it possible that for the last 100 years or so, countries have raised their people's standard of living by going from agriculture to manufacturing, assembly line manufacturing, instead of one person working? Is it possible that India can skip through or go very quickly through that manufacturing phase and end up somewhere else?
Well, that's a point that's discussed a lot because Modi has put a lot of pressure on the idea of making products in India, which means manufacturing and so on. And that turns out to be difficult to achieve. And India is already moving quickly towards a service-dominated economy, services of various kinds. there are exceptions to this. It's very hard to talk about this subject because, for example, there are some very large projects going on in the energy field, for example, defense manufacturing, that are just starting with foreign companies. And my feeling is that he will achieve more in terms of employment and manufacturing than people give him credit for. When he first started that objective, people said, well, you know, that's out of date. Nobody's going to set up manufacturing. But it was announced not too long ago that Foxconn in Taiwan was going to move some of its lower-end manufacturing processes into India, which would create jobs in India and move them from China, because in China labor costs are rising very quickly and people are looking at moving to India. So as the point over here, lower wages and may not be a disadvantage. It may turn out that they are an advantage, and if people are satisfied with a higher wage level that's not as high as the global standard, for example, I mean, really their decision, and maybe that will work. I just don't know. I think that it's too early to tell whether manufacturing is going to be a sustainable activity for Modi in terms of creating jobs. But he is trying it, and we'll have to see. There are plenty of companies that are ready to have a shot at it, but you know, it's kind of amazing what goes on. For example, one of the things that India has to do is to reform its government banking system. Very, very important. Recapitalize it and reform the governance of their system. And there's private banks that have expanded into rural India in a major way. The government banks haven't done it because they don't have the capital, the leadership, the continuity, and so on to do it at this point because they're undercapitalized. But the private banks, several of them, have moved heavily into rural India. And they hire people in rural India, and they train them. And they have a lending program at village level, regular loans of all kinds. And you know, this is a very important development because when I was there, a farmer, if he wanted credit, either had to go to a loan shark, charging him 40 or 50% or maybe more, or a micro lender, who was usually a group of ladies lending very small amounts of money. And there was nothing in between. So banks are coming out there and providing something in between and the services that go with it. And as this happens, credit will be extended more on more sizable and better terms into rural India. So again, it's just another one of these signs of change taking place at village level. And Modi has announced this idea of smart cities, secondary cities being converted into smart cities that, you know, are in theory at least paperless service providers. And the evidence that some of this is working is the simple fact that companies like Amazon and others are expanding at an enormous rate in India with offers of e-commerce services. Now, e-commerce was thought to be unworkable in India a year ago because of infrastructure problems. You know, a lot of streets don't have names. You know, it's a hard place to operate a sort of e-commerce delivery system. But people are overcoming those things. And I've already given the example of non-literate people using handsets effectively. It is really changing very, very fast. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, India has not always been a model of ethnic and religious stability. And we do have a huge Islamic population that Al-Qaeda has recently said that they're going to designate for an interest. You have a right-wing growth of Hindu nationalism. And you always have ethnic flare-ups even within Hinduism. What do you think will keep this stability that we maybe are enjoying, or at least on the surface enjoying, in India and keep it from exploding in the future?
My answer to that is that their track record up till now as a country with 150 to 175 million Muslims So far, for example, the Muslim community has not been radicalized. And we spent a lot of time trying to understand why. And it comes down to the simple fact that I think my personal view is that Islam in India was softened in the period of the Mughals, when the Persians came in and the invaders were surrounded by Hindu wives, concubines, advisors, etc., over a 300-year period. And Islam, I think, was softened. I can't prove that, but it seems to me that something has been successful historically there, because what we found was that Indians were first and foremost Indians, and secondly, Muslims. And that worked pretty well. There have been outbreaks of extreme communal violence, that's true. And Modi was accused of fomenting or not doing enough to stop that in 2002. And it's constantly on the mind of people when it comes to elections. And we experienced problems with this, for example, in the attempt to abolish polio when I was there, because certain Muslim communities where you had to abolish polio for 3 years, no new cases. We kept getting 40 or 50 or 100 new cases in northern areas of India with Muslim populations, where not very progressive Muslim communities were convinced the drops that were being given were aimed at making their children infertile. In fact, what was happening was that those kids were so sick with diarrhea, they couldn't keep the drops long enough for them to work. And so the government went to a program of giving injections. And this, again, was regarded by these Muslim communities as an attempt by the government to make their children infertile by this program. So you're up against those kinds of things. But those were overcome, and polio was eradicated successfully after I left. We did some research on the recruitment of terrorists in India. We found, first of all, very little in the way of successful recruitment, almost none at all in the madrasas of India that have been set up by Saudis and others investing in this. And the conversions or recruitments were taking place among specific groupings that were unemployed or unhappy in some way. It was not to do with madrasas and teachings. And those people who were recruited and took part in something usually were in the position of a driver or holding somebody's coat while they did things. They weren't chief motivators and movers. And this became a very important issue at the time of the hotel attacks, when I think, as you stated earlier, was a turning point, because in all the years I was in India, everything we did with India worked. All of our joint operations, except cooperation, operational cooperation in counterterrorism. We shared intelligence with them, but they never trusted us enough on the operational side because of our relationship with Pakistan. And that was a just judgment on their part, in my view, because when an attack took place in India, whereas we said in state we oppose terrorism everywhere in the world, we never punished Pakistan for its outrages in India. And so they found that very unconvincing. But then at the time of the Mumbai hotel attacks, they changed home ministers. And within 24 hours, they had agreed to bring in an FBI on-the-ground forensic unit of people from LA, Atlanta, and New York, I think it was, 12 guys, who went right to the Mumbai police in one day. They got all their high-tech stuff in there. And they showed the Mumbai police how to take a melted or damaged cell phone from the body of a terrorist and derive from it the verbal communications that had been in there. And this enabled us to put together the verbatim conversations between handlers in Pakistan and the terrorists in the hotels. We had all those conversations. And we had countries, 11 countries were affected with people killed. We distributed that portfolio to everybody, and we made it known that the claim of Pakistan, namely that that wasn't planned on their territory and wasn't carried out by Pakistani nationals, was bogus, untrue. And the other evidence that we had was a satellite telephone that we recovered from one of the dinghies in the harbor. And we did a map, the cops in Mumbai and the FBI guys, that showed where that phone had been with a yellow dot in northern India and Pakistan every day for 4 weeks before the attack. It never left Pakistan. It never left the area of the terrorist camps until it went to Karachi. We knew what house it was in, what street it was in. It went to the harbor, and we had a trace of it all the way down the coast to Mumbai. So the idea that Pakistan was guiltless was absolute nonsense. And if you had read those verbatim conversations, you would have been horrified by what you read about the directions given by those guys up in Karachi or wherever they were, Islamabad, to execute people and so on. So now we have, because I presented to them for years why they should work with us. Because I said, we're a federal system. We have federal guys, state guys, county guys. Every time you see a movie when you were growing up, it was all about the competition between the FBI, the sheriff, the local fellows in LA or whatever it was. And that was what the story was about. And you have the same problem here. As they went around and attacked different markets, they had trouble ever prosecuting anybody and finding them and preventing it. So things are improving, and of course the result is there have not been terrorist outrages until lately, when the Pakistanis came over the border and killed Indian soldiers in Kashmir. And unlike at the hotel attacks, when India did not strike back, a wise decision in my view at that time, Modi did strike back this time. Why did he strike back? What risk did he take? In my view, minimal. Because India cannot forever accept Pakistani incursions and not punish. But in punishing, they'd have to try to do it in a way that avoids a counterattack and war where people reach to the nuclear closet, you know, hot-headed people. So I certainly was for the counter-strike. And one of the reasons, this has to do with your question, is that China's relations have grown so broad across South Asia, especially with Pakistan, that my view was, if China has a big relationship with Pakistan, China certainly doesn't want to be part of a nuclear war in South Asia. So they probably will be a controlling force in Pakistan. And so far, there's been no counter-strike. So it seems to be right. Yes, sir.
Non-alignment was a cornerstone of the Indian foreign policy in the old days. Is it still alive, or is it fading away? What is your take on the situation?
My take on that is that it died when I was there, or maybe before, or at least it was severely palsied, because they began to realize how hard it, as a progressing country, how hard it is to manage a whole collection of non-aligned countries like that. Now that India is a much more established power, I don't think they'll go back to that. And they are showing signs of more mature leadership, if I could put it that way. Yes, sir.
What are the chances that the United States might declare Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism in the next year or two?
I don't know what the chances are. We should have done it years ago, in my view. I mean, I'm not anti-Pakistan, but I mean, enough's enough, you know, and they are guilty of carrying out you know, the first time I was in India in 2005, October 26th, I think it was, I went out to a school outside of New Delhi to give a talk to parents and so on that evening. And I got a phone call that there'd been an attack in the Sarojini Market in New Delhi that night. And there were 60-some people killed in a very fiery blast of blasts which exploded other canisters of natural gas and so on. So it was a very desperate situation. And we then looked into our intelligence that followed that, and we found that the Pakistani motivation was that the programs they had for terrorist activities in Kashmir were not producing enough headlines for them on the evening news and various other things. So they wanted to have a broader attack that would divide communities and destroy confidence between communities in India. And their plan was to attack markets all over India, which they did with crude pipe bombs and various other things. And that led up to the railway attacks in Mumbai, and then that led up to the hotel attacks. And at that point, Manmohan Singh's government debated whether or not to counterstrike. But the reasoning was a counterstrike won't get the people who did this. It won't. The camps are empty now. You won't achieve anything. And if it stimulates the Pakistanis to strike back and then we strike back, it won't be long before Pakistan knows it's going to lose and it'll reach for the nuclear closet. And I was with them on that decision. But this time, I think Modi was right. And once he's done that, there's nothing like punching a bully in the nose, in the playground to stop it. Yes, sir.
India has always been somewhat ambivalent about foreign direct investment. Could you comment on what the state of play currently is?
Modi has said he wants to have a lot of foreign direct investment, and he did do it in Gujarat. I lead a group of investors out to India every year, and one year, about before he was prime minister, we went to Gujarat where this miracle had been taking place. You'll like this story. So I had all these American investors, these guys wanted to know what the secret of Gujarat was. So we went into a room, and the director of investment, a kind of bouncy guy, came in, and they said to him, okay, what is the secret of your success in attracting all this FDI? The guy said, well, let's see. He said, first of all, you have to understand we have laws about this, and they're all federal laws that lay out what's legal and what is not legal. Secondly, we have a huge body of regulations that govern foreign direct investment, and those are also federal. So we have to abide by them. So really the only thing we do here is return telephone calls, keep commitments, be on time, and so on. The ABCs of doing business anywhere. And of course, it deflated our group of investors. But that is really the story. Now, what Modi hasn't done, he hasn't been as aggressive. For example, he's not agreed, as I think he should, to agree multi-brand retailing. It's a silly decision, but it's a big political issue for the BJP. Secondly, he has permitted the legislation that was passed in the last government in a fit of pique by the finance minister of the time, where, with regard to a Vodafone tax issue, the Supreme Court overruled the government and said the tax department has no jurisdiction on that tax case. So he issued legislation that said, we have jurisdiction and we're going to be able to review any investment back to 1962. And that's called the retroactive tax provisions, or the terrorist tax provisions by some people. And I think they made a big mistake. I think Modi should have, when he came in, should have said, I wasn't in Parliament then. We're getting rid of this because it's a sort of, maybe we've said we're not going to enforce it, but what about future governments and so on and so forth. But he hasn't done that, and I wish he would, but he hasn't. The other mistake Modi made, which was just inconceivable to me, was that there was a flaw on the Indian follow-through on the nuclear legislation after we did the deal. They had to pass legislation that conformed civil nuclear liability law in India to the global standard. And instead, they got all fouled up in Parliament, and they ended up with a version of the law that puts the risk on suppliers and not on the operator. And this effectively has shut down capital from coming in for civil nuclear development. And I think he should have come in and said, look, because it was the BJP that did this in opposition. They're the ones who queered that deal. So when he came in, he should have said, look, I wasn't there. We made a mistake. We're going to fix this. Instead, they're going through an elaborate dance of insurance and contracts and all kinds of things. They got a couple of people interested. Westinghouse is supposedly interested in working on some deals. But I think they have to fix that at some point, or else they won't see the capital come in. Yes, sir.
What is the current central bank interbank lending rate in India? Do you know?
Gosh, that's an embarrassing question because I don't know.
Well, you mentioned that you thought it might.
I think it'll come down a bit. You know, Rajan was very famous and the former central banker, and he was replaced to everybody's angst. The new man I've met, he's a very competent guy, and I know why they replaced Rajan, which is they wanted a central banker and not a global philosopher on top of it, as they put it. So they made that decision.
So it must be higher than the U.S.
Oh yeah, no, it's probably. I mean, I'm thinking it's around 4 3/4, maybe something like that, 5%. Yep.
What chances an Indian farmer that has 3.5 acres and loses 40% of his produce on the way to the market have a chance in competing with the international agribusiness?
Well, the answer to that, in part at least, is to sell his wheat at a competitive price. And with a handset, I mean, when I got to India, I went to the biggest grain market in India, which is up in the north, and these poor guys drove wagons of wheat in, and they had to take whatever the market was that day. And they had to pay an amount of fees and taxes equal to 11% of the nominal value of their sale. And they had no choice to sell it that day unless they wanted to just drive their wagon back and unload it. Now they can open up a handset, they can find out the price, they can do a contract for delivery, payment against delivery of the wheat, and that is improving things. But you're right, they are not competitive, but they are such a huge market that they have their own market to supply. So, you know, they run a rather protectionist agricultural system. And that's something that a lot of people argue should change, but a lot of farmers probably don't want to change because they're able to sell their product in India. Yep. I guess one more question I'm being told, although I should ask this lady here.
Thank you, Ambassador. I noticed that your presentation asked the question, India still rising, and with all that you've told us, clearly it is still rising. And I've noticed that something that you've mentioned often is infrastructure, and how though it's and with the eminent growth and continued growth, how are they bridging this infrastructure? One thing that you mentioned was that it shouldn't be weighed against nations like China in terms of growth in certain areas, but to look at it as 19th century America and how it developed from there. And that is a challenge that faces most developing economies, like in sub-Saharan Africa, where they weigh them against larger economies, but not take them at the growth that they're making at that level. But with the eminent growth and continued growth, how do you see the infrastructure, particularly with roads, because that is very important in fueling in business and so forth, and with all the companies that you say that are bringing in more business, that is something very important. I mean, looking here at Houston, when with all the growth that we have here, how much roads and roads are important to that sustained growth?
The answer to that is, first of all, I didn't mean to be too flip about 19th century America. I just thought it's useful sometimes to try to remember. Getting around wasn't easy in those days. The truth is that at the moment, there is a huge road program, and large amounts of money being put into the building of roads, and a more aggressive policy of land acquisition, where farmers are being paid now something like 4 to 5 times the value of the land they have for for the government to take it. It used to be the government would take land and then somebody else would buy it and then resell it at some higher price. That's not happening so much. There is a fair deal now going on. And I saw the highways minister when I was there. And, you know, he said to me, he's going to build 30 kilometers of road every day. So I said to him, how many kilometers do you build now? He says, 3. So then I asked some experts, how many kilometers of road can you build in a day? And they said, well, 6 to 9. So that minister was doing what the old planning people used to do. In other words, the planning commission's dead, but not in the brain of that guy. So he's still talking a little unrealistically, but they are funding much more in the way of roads. And also railroad development is a very high priority, freight movement and opening and they have the land for that. They have the right of ways. So that'll be an area where, you know, there's a separate budget in India. There's a budget day in Parliament for the railroad minister. Something like 3 million people work for the railroads. It's an enormous business. And they work pretty well, really. They got more railroad lines than anybody in the world. So those things, I think, are happening. There was one more question here.
Ambassador, you mentioned that India's had a break with the low oil prices. But can you expand a little bit about energy policy? I mean, going back 20 years to that old power project, the kind of disappointments with natural gas, the reliance on coal. Where do you see this, and is it a constraint on their future growth?
I would say that energy policy in India, in my retrospect at least, has been chaotic, as has a lot of other policies in India. And they are improving to some extent. But even recently, they got into this thing where coal companies were buying foreign coal mines to send coal to India because it was too complicated for environmental reasons to get the coal in India. So these kinds of idiosyncrasies, which are legion in India, I'm not saying they're dying, but they are diminishing to some extent. For example, one of the things that Modi's done, very simple, is ministers who don't come to work at 9 o'clock are fired. They used to come at 11, maybe. That's an improvement. And corruption at cabinet level has been stopped. And I know that because I talk with all the business guys who used to run the system of corruption, and they say it's over, they can't get it done anymore. So you have to believe them, at least I do. So there is progress. And in India, you know, it's there's just about every kind of diversity you can think of, and exception. So it's very hard to generalize, which is what I've done tonight. I hope with some effect. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.